I learned what public means when a microphone squealed just as my boss said my name, then skipped it, handing my promotion to his nephew while I stood there clapping like a trained seal. 8 months later, that same nephew was in handcuffs for bank fraud. My ex-wife was serving 18 months in federal prison, and I was consulting for their biggest competitor at triple my old salary. HR had called my termination standard procedure, but federal prosecutors called the conspiracy that followed it wire fraud, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy, each carrying a maximum sentence of 20 years. "Congratulations to our new Director of Strategic Operations," Davidson announced, his smile as practiced as his handshake. "Tommy Davidson will be taking over effective immediately." The applause started before the words finished. Polite, measured clapping that filled the glass-walled room I designed the layout for. I found myself clapping too, muscle memory from 1,000 meetings where I'd celebrated other people's advancements while mine got deferred to next quarter or pending restructure. Tommy stood, 28 years old, MBA fresh as printer paper, wearing a suit that cost more than my quarterly bonus. He'd been with the company 14 months. I'd trained him myself on the Hendricks account, the one that now represented 40% of our revenue stream. "I'm excited to build on the strong foundation we have here," he said, and I noticed he didn't look at me. Neither did Davidson. Neither did anyone, actually, except Sarah from Analytics, who caught my eye with something between sympathy and horror. The meeting continued around me like water around a stone. Budget projections, Q4 targets, the Meridian pitch scheduled for Thursday. My pitch, the one I'd spent 8 months crafting, complete with risk assessments and technical specifications that existed nowhere but in my head and the blue notebook under my left arm. "Any questions?" Davidson's voice seemed to come from underwater. I had questions, 8 years' worth, about the performance reviews that rated me exceptional every cycle, about the promises of partnership track, the equity discussions that always got tabled, the overtime I'd logged during my daughter's birthday parties and my father's funeral, about the email I'd sent 3 weeks ago outlining my 5-year strategic vision for the department, the same vision Tommy had just presented, word for word, slide by slide. But I didn't raise my hand. Instead, I stood when the meeting ended, gathered my notebook and pen, and followed the crowd toward the door. In the hallway, voices carried further than people expected. "He won't cause problems," I heard Davidson telling someone near the elevator. "He needs this job. Wife, mortgage, you know how it is." Something in me set like cured concrete in that moment. Not anger. Anger was temporary, messy, loud. This was structural, foundational, the kind of quiet that builds cathedrals and moves mountains. I walked to my desk, former desk, and began packing. 2 cardboard boxes from the supply closet. My coffee mug, the one that said, "World's Most Patient Manager." My backup drive, the framed photo of Emma at her graduation. The signed baseball from the client who'd called me the only honest consultant in the business. HR arrived before I finished. Maria Santos, clipboard in hand, manila envelope tucked under her arm like evidence at a trial. "Standard procedure," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Security will escort you out." Standard procedure. As if humiliation were a line item in someone's budget. I signed where they pointed and walked toward the exit, past the team I'd built, past the whiteboard that still held my handwriting from yesterday's planning session. The security guard, Jim, who I'd bought lunch for when his daughter was in the hospital, walked 3 feet behind me like I was carrying state secrets instead of a coffee mug and a broken stapler. In the parking lot, my phone buzzed. 7 missed calls, all from clients asking specifically for me. I saved every voicemail. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and began taking inventory, not just of what they'd taken, but of what they thought they'd taken. Assets and vulnerabilities, contracts and recordings, the difference between what belonged to them and what belonged to me. I chose silence over scenes, precision over rage. The war wouldn't be won in conference rooms. The parking lot felt like a stage with no audience. I loaded 2 cartons into my Honda, 8 years compressed into 24 cubic inches of corrugated cardboard. The framed certificates from industry conferences, the thank you notes from grateful clients, The backup drive containing 3 years of project documentation I'd compiled on my own time, using my own laptop. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. 13 voicemails by the time I reached the car, each one a small victory I hadn't expected. "Hi, this is Janet Morrison from Meridian Group. I'm trying to reach you about Thursday's presentation. Your direct line seems to be disconnected, and I specifically requested you handle our technical briefing. Save, this is Marcus Webb at Pinnacle Industries. We've got a crisis with the Southeast rollout, and I need the guy who actually knows how this system works, not some junior consultant. Save, hey, it's Claire from Northbridge Capital. We're expanding the contract, but only if we can guarantee you're the lead on implementation." Save, each message was a thread in a tapestry I hadn't realized I'd been weaving. While Davidson and Tommy had been managing presentations, I'd been managing relationships. While they'd been polishing optics, I'd been solving problems. The market knew the difference, even when the org chart didn't. At home, I spread everything across the kitchen table like evidence at a crime scene. Employment contract, 47 pages of legalese I'd signed without reading 8 years ago. Non-compete clause, page 31, subsection C. Intellectual property assignments, page 19. Severance terms buried in an appendix like a whispered confession. The notebook felt heavier than it should have. Blue leather binding, my initials embossed in gold. A gift from Emma when I made senior analyst. Every page filled with my handwriting. Process maps, client preferences, technical specifications that existed nowhere in the company's official documentation. I'd bought it, I'd filled it, I'd carried it to every meeting for 3 years. Try to claim that belongs to you, I thought. My laptop showed access revoked at 4:17 p.m., 13 minutes after Maria Santos had slid that envelope across the conference table. But the system logs would show something interesting to anyone who cared to look. I'd been working from personal devices for months, backing up my own work to my own drives, because the company's security was Swiss cheese and their backup protocols were a joke. The marriage folder sat in the file cabinet's bottom drawer, untouched for 2 years but suddenly relevant. Joint accounts, mortgage papers, insurance beneficiaries. The refinance offers that had been showing up in our mailbox, addressed to Sarah but marked pre-approved in cheerful red ink. Strange, since we'd never applied. I made 3 lists. What they thought they'd taken. What they'd actually taken. What they'd never had to begin with. The 3rd list was longer than I'd expected. I poured coffee, checked the security app on my phone, all cameras green, house quiet, and began planning the next phase. Not revenge. Process. The kind that leaves paper trails and court orders instead of regrets. Silence over scenes. Precision over rage. Let them think I was beaten. The first rule of strategy is never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. The kitchen table had become my archaeology site. Layers of my professional life spread across the surface like sedimentary rock. Coffee ring stains on contracts. Sticky notes marking dates that suddenly mattered. Yellow highlighter bleeding through pages of promises that had evaporated the moment Tommy's name was announced. I started with the email thread from 18 months ago. Leadership track discussion, confidential in the subject line. Davidson's assurance that I was exactly the kind of forward-thinking professional we want to develop. 6 emails promising mentorship, strategic planning sessions, and accelerated advancement opportunities. The thread died the week after Tommy was hired. Next to it, the training deck I'd created for the Henderson Industries onboarding. 47 slides of process documentation, client psychology notes, and technical specifications. My name appeared once, in tiny font on the title slide. Tommy's name was everywhere else, added after I'd submitted the final version. The metadata told the truth. Created by me, modified by him, presented to the board as his original work. I pulled out a legal pad and began mapping the pattern. Saturday morning in February, emergency call about the Westfield crisis. I'd spent 12 hours rebuilding their data architecture while my family went to Emma's swim meet without me. Monday morning email. Great team effort on the Westfield save. No individual credit, just team effort. March. Davidson asking me to show Tommy the ropes on client relationship management. I'd written a 60-page manual, conducted one-on-one training sessions, introduced him to every major client personally. April's board presentation. Tommy's innovative approach to client relations has yielded impressive results. The relationships I'd spent 3 years cultivating, rebranded as his networking genius. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. My competence had become invisible infrastructure, the electrical grid that nobody thinks about until the lights go out. My sacrifice was background music at their success concert. Every crisis I'd solved, every weekend I'd worked, every family dinner I'd missed had been processed into raw material for their advancement. I stopped asking why me and started asking what next. The timeline looked different from this angle. Not betrayal, strategy. They'd needed my knowledge, my client relationships, my crisis management skills. But knowledge could be extracted, relationships could be transferred, and skills could be documented. Once the download was complete, the original hardware became redundant. Smart, ruthless. Probably not entirely legal, given the intellectual property clauses in my contract and the creative editing of my work product. I opened my laptop and began building a different kind of documentation. Screenshot timestamps showing the original authorship of training materials. Email threads demonstrating the gap between my contributions and the official record. Client communication logs proving the personal nature of relationships they'd assumed were company assets. The voice recorder app on my phone still held 3 months of meeting audio. A habit I'd developed after too many "I never said that" conversations with Davidson. Digital breadcrumbs I'd scattered without knowing I was mapping a trail back to the truth. I made a new list. Evidence preserved. Evidence needed. Evidence they didn't know existed. The third category was the longest. Patience had been my signature strength. Now it would become my weapon. They'd taught me exactly how institutional betrayal worked. Time to show them how institutional accountability responded. My phone buzzed for the 15th time in an hour. Davidson's name lit up the screen like a warning light. I let it go to voicemail, same as the other 14 calls. The Starbucks on 5th Street had become my temporary office. Laptop open to job boards, I wasn't seriously browsing. Resume document minimized in the corner. I was waiting. Watching. Learning what happened when the safety net I'd been weaving for 8 years suddenly wasn't there. Sarah texted at 9:47 a.m. They can't find the Meridian technical specs. Tommy's asking where you kept the client database matrices. I sipped my coffee and typed back, "Good luck with that." The matrices existed in exactly one place. The blue notebook that was currently sitting in my kitchen drawer, along with 3 years of client preference maps, troubleshooting protocols, and the custom algorithms I developed for data integration. None of it existed in the company's systems because their documentation standards were a suggestion, not a requirement. I'd learned to keep my own records when Davidson's memory proved unreliable and the company's backup systems proved non-existent. My phone buzzed again. Not Davidson this time. Janet Morrison from Meridian Group. "This is extremely unprofessional," her voicemail began. "We requested you specifically for Thursday's presentation. Your replacement seems to think our technical requirements are negotiable. They are not. If you're not leading this project, we're reconsidering the entire contract." Delete. Another buzz. Marcus Webb from Pinnacle Industries. "Your people are telling me you're no longer with the company. That's unfortunate, because we specifically structured this deal around your involvement. Call me." Delete. By noon, the pattern was clear. The LinkedIn post celebrating Tommy's promotion had gone live at 8 a.m., all corporate optimism and forward momentum. The reality was playing out in real time through my text messages. Sarah reporting panicked meetings, missing documentation, and a growing awareness that they'd fired the institutional memory. The Meridian meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. I knew because I'd been preparing for it for 8 months. I'd built the presentation framework, mapped the technical requirements, identified the 3 potential deal breakers and their solutions. Tommy had attended exactly 2 planning meetings, both times checking his phone while I walked through the complexities. At 2:17 p.m., Sarah texted, "Client walked out. Said they specifically asked for technical depth and got marketing fluff. Davidson is losing his mind." At 2:45 p.m., my phone rang. Not Davidson, Janet Morrison calling me directly. I let it go to voicemail. "Listen," her message began. "I don't know what's happening over there, but we need someone who understands our infrastructure. We're willing to discuss alternatives. Call me. I opened my laptop and began researching consulting rates for my specialty. The market price for competence was higher than I'd expected, especially when supplies suddenly became scarce. By 4 p.m., I had 3 offers for contract work, all from former clients, all at rates that made my old salary look like charity work. I didn't call them back, not yet. First rule of negotiation: let demand exceed supply. Second rule: make them realize what they've lost before showing them what they could gain. The coffee shop was closing, but the real business was just beginning. The house felt different at 6 p.m. on a Wednesday. Usually, I'd be fighting traffic, checking emails at red lights, arriving home to find Sarah already cooking dinner with that particular smile that meant she'd had a good day. Instead, I sat in my kitchen reviewing security footage from a system I'd installed 3 years ago when the neighborhood had a break-in problem. Funny how safety measures become surveillance tools when trust starts to crack. The Ring app showed 17 motion alerts from the past week. Normal activity, delivery trucks, neighbors walking dogs, Sarah leaving for work and returning. But Tuesday's timeline had gaps I couldn't explain. Her car in the driveway at 11 a.m. when she should have been at the office. A silver BMW I didn't recognize parked across the street from 11:15 to 2:30. I scrolled back further. The BMW appeared in 12 different recordings over the past month, always during business hours, always parked with a clear view of our front door. The driver never got out within camera range, but the license plate was clear enough. Colorado tags, personal vehicle, not commercial. My laptop chimed with an email notification. Wells Fargo. Your refinance application is under review. I stared at the screen. We hadn't applied for a refinance. Our mortgage rate was locked at 3.2%. Refinancing would cost us money, not save it. I forwarded the email to my personal account and called the bank. Yes, Mr. Harrison, I show an application submitted on Monday for your property at 1247 Maple Street. Looks like your wife initiated the process. She provided all the necessary documentation and signatures. Can you email me a copy of what was submitted? I'll need to verify some security questions first. 20 minutes later, I was staring at my own signature on forms I'd never seen. The handwriting was close. Sarah had always been good at forgeries, a skill she'd laughed about from her college days when she'd sign her roommate's name on absence forms. But my middle initial wavered where it should have been firm, and the pressure was too light. The refinance would pull $150,000 in equity from the house we'd spent 8 years building together. The paperwork listed a debt consolidation purpose, but our only debt was the mortgage itself and Sarah's car payment. I opened the Quicken file we shared. No unusual expenses, no credit card debt that would justify consolidation. But the activity log showed someone had accessed the account yesterday from an IP address I didn't recognize. The security app chimed. Motion at the front door. Sarah's key in the lock, 30 minutes earlier than usual. I minimized the banking windows and met her in the hallway with what I hoped looked like a normal smile. How was your day? She asked, setting down her purse in exactly the spot the morning camera had captured. Productive, I said. Figured out a few things I'd been wondering about. She kissed my cheek, and I smelled cologne that wasn't mine. I'm going to shower, she said. Long day. While the water ran upstairs, I forwarded the refinance documents to an email address I'd memorized but never used. My college roommate who'd become a family law attorney in Denver. Some questions were better asked by professionals. The house was quiet except for running water and the soft hum of cameras recording everything in 1080p resolution. The Village Inn on Colfax looked like every other family restaurant built in 1987. Brown vinyl booths, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look tired, and coffee that had been brewing since the Carter administration. Perfect for conversations that needed to stay off LinkedIn. Jake Martinez slid into the booth across from me carrying a manila folder and the same careful expression he'd worn through 3 years of law school. We'd been roommates at CU, back when his biggest worry was constitutional law and mine was fluid dynamics. Now he specialized in family law and white-collar crime, which made him exactly the right person for a conversation I'd never planned to have. You look like hell, he said, signaling the waitress for coffee. Feel worse. Thanks for meeting me on short notice. He opened the folder and spread the documents I'd forwarded across the table like tarot cards predicting a complicated future. Bank statements, refinance applications, security footage timestamps, and the signature comparison I'd printed from 3 different documents. "Walk me through it again," he said. "Start with the work situation." I gave him the timeline. Promotion stolen. Intellectual property reassigned. Client relationships transferred. Forced termination disguised as restructuring. He took notes in shorthand I couldn't read, occasionally asking questions that made me realize how much evidence I'd been collecting without realizing it. Now the domestic situation. The refinance fraud, the unfamiliar vehicle, the forged signatures that wobbled where mine stayed firm. He studied the signature samples with a magnifying glass he'd pulled from his briefcase, apparently a habit from his criminal law rotation. "These are definitely forgeries," he said. "Good ones, but forgeries. See how the pressure changes mid-letter? That's conscious effort, not muscle memory. Your wife's handwriting? She used to joke about it in college. Said she could forge anyone's signature after watching them write it 3 times. Not joking now." He lined up the bank documents chronologically. "This is systematic. The refinance application, the property access authorization, the equity withdrawal request. They're all dated to coincide with your work crisis. Someone coordinated this." The waitress refilled our coffee. Jake waited until she was out of earshot before continuing. "You've got multiple felonies here. Bank fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The timing suggests your job termination was designed to destabilize you before you noticed the property theft. What are my options? Legal or practical?" "Both." He pulled out his phone and scrolled through contacts. "Legal. We file a fraud report with the bank today, get an injunction against any property transfers, and start preservation letters to your former company. I've got a colleague who specializes in employment law, wrongful termination with a side of intellectual property theft. And practical? You document everything, say nothing to anyone, and let them think they're winning while we build a bulletproof case. The beauty of criminals is they always think they're smarter than they are. Give them enough rope." He handed me a business card I didn't recognize. "Michelle Chen, forensic accountant. She'll trace the money trail and find connections you didn't know existed. This isn't someone's first rodeo. The check came to $8.47. I left a 20. "One more thing," Jake said as we stood to leave. "Change all your passwords tonight. Bank accounts, email, everything. If they're willing to forge signatures, they're probably willing to read your mail." Outside, Denver traffic hummed past while my life reorganized itself around new realities. Attorney retainers, fraud investigations, and the possibility that I'd been married to a stranger. I drove home to a house that looked the same but felt like evidence. The paperwork felt heavier than it should have. 3 folders containing 18 months of careful preparation condensed into legal documents that would reshape the playing field permanently. I sat in Jake's office at 7 a.m. on a Friday, signing forms that would make my name a different kind of rumor by lunch. "The bank freeze goes into effect the moment these are filed," Jake explained, sliding the injunction papers across his desk. "Joint accounts, credit lines, any financial instrument with both your names. She'll get a notification, but no access." Michelle Chen, the forensic accountant, had worked through the night tracking digital breadcrumbs I hadn't known existed. The refinance application connected to a consulting firm that shared an address with Tommy Davidson's previous employer. The silver BMW was registered to a shell company that existed only on paper and shared a phone number with Davidson's Nephew's LLC. "This is professional-grade fraud," she'd told us yesterday. "Multiple coordinated actors, careful timing, sophisticated document forgery. Someone's done this before." The preservation letters to my former company were surgical. Specific enough to lock down evidence, vague enough to avoid showing our full hand. Davidson would spend his weekend wondering which of his conversations had been recorded and which of his emails were now evidence in a federal investigation. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Working late tonight. Don't wait up." I showed Jake the message. He photographed it with his phone and added it to the evidence file. "Establishing a pattern of deception," he said. "Juries love timelines." The process server was a grandmother from Littleton who looked like she baked cookies for church fundraisers. "They never see me coming," she'd told us with a smile that belonged in a different conversation. She had the Wells Fargo fraud report, the property injunction, and a cease and desist letter that would arrive at Davidson's office Monday morning like a guided missile with a legal letterhead. By 9 a.m., I was driving to a different kind of meeting. Downtown office building, 32nd floor, view of the mountains that reminded me why I'd moved to Colorado in the first place. The nameplate on the conference room door read Pinnacle Solutions, and Marcus Webb was waiting with a contract that made my old salary look like an insult. "We've been following your situation," he said. "Industrial espionage isn't uncommon in our sector, but the way you've handled it is impressive. We need someone who thinks strategically under pressure." I read the offer twice. Senior consultant, 6-month contract with renewal options, rate structure that would triple my annual income. Non-compete clause specifically excluded my former employer. Jake had negotiated that detail yesterday. "There's one condition," Marcus continued. "We work with several firms your old company considers competitors. Full disclosure is required, but anything you learned on your own time, using your own resources, remains your intellectual property." The blue notebook had never belonged to Davidson's company. Neither had the client relationships I'd built through weekend calls and emergency troubleshooting sessions. Neither had the algorithms I'd developed on my personal laptop during Sarah's book club meetings. I signed the contract at 10:47 a.m. By noon, my LinkedIn profile showed a new position and a professional headshot that didn't look like a man who'd been fired. The market moved faster than memory. 3 former clients had already called to discuss bringing their business to Pinnacle. I didn't gloat. I documented the calls, forwarded the contact information to my new team, and drove home to a house where the security cameras were recording everything in high definition. Let them think they'd won until the papers arrived. Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I was supposed to be presenting 8 months of work to Meridian Group's board of directors. Instead, I sat in Pinnacle's conference room, watching my former life implode through a series of increasingly frantic text messages. "Sarah, 8:47 a.m. They're asking for your calibration protocols. Tommy can't find them anywhere." The calibration protocols existed in exactly one place. Page 47 of the blue notebook, written in my handwriting during a weekend when Sarah had gone to visit her sister. The protocols weren't just documentation. They were the difference between a system that worked and a system that failed spectacularly under load. Sarah, 9:15 a.m. Meeting started. Davidson looks nervous. I opened my laptop and pulled up the Meridian technical specifications I'd drafted on my own time, using industry standards I'd learned through professional development courses I'd paid for myself. The work product belonged to me, not to the company that had fired me for refusing to be invisible. My phone rang. Marcus Webb, calling from the conference room down the hall. "Your old team is having some difficulties," he said. "Meridian's CTO just called asking if we'd be interested in taking over their integration project. Apparently, the current vendor can't deliver the technical depth they were promised." Sarah, 9:43 a.m. Client asked specifically for the load balancing algorithms you developed. Tommy's trying to explain why they're proprietary and unavailable. The algorithms weren't proprietary to Davidson's company. I'd developed them during my master's program, refined them through consulting work I'd done independently, and documented them in academic papers published under my name. They'd become part of my toolkit before I'd ever heard of Davidson or his nephew. Sarah, 10:02 a.m. This is bad. Janet Morrison walked out, said she specifically requested technical competence, not marketing presentations. I walked to the window overlooking downtown Denver. Somewhere across the city, a conference room full of people was discovering the difference between having a technical expert and having someone who'd watched a technical expert work. The gap between competence and confidence was wider than they'd calculated. My phone buzzed with a call from Janet Morrison herself. I let it go to voicemail. "Listen," her message began. "I don't know what happened over there, but we need our project completed by someone who actually understands infrastructure architecture. Marcus Webb says you're available for consulting work. Name your rate." Sarah, 10:31 a.m. Davidson's on the phone with legal. Something about non-compete violations and intellectual property theft. This is really bad. I forwarded the message to Jake Martinez with a note. "FYI, they're panicking." Marcus knocked on my doorframe. "Meridian wants to meet this afternoon. They're willing to discuss a premium rate for emergency consulting. Apparently, their current vendor just lost credibility with their board. What's the timeline? 6 weeks to deliver what they were promised in 6 months. Can you do it? I thought about the calibration protocols, the load balancing algorithms, and the 3 years of client-specific knowledge that existed nowhere in Davidson's files. I can do it properly. Sarah, 11:15 a.m. Stock dropped 3% on news of Meridian account uncertainty. Davidson's locked in his office. I didn't reply to any of her messages. Instead, I spent lunch reviewing Meridian's actual requirements. Not the simplified version Tommy had been working from, but the complex technical reality that required expertise rather than enthusiasm. By 2 p.m., I was sitting across from Janet Morrison, signing a consulting agreement that paid more for 6 weeks of work than I'd earned in 6 months at Davidson's company. The market had decided. Competence commanded a premium, especially when supply became scarce. I still didn't gloat. I just worked. Meeting someone about the house situation. We'll be home late. Sarah's text came at 2:17 p.m. At 3:23 p.m., the motion sensors triggered. I watched through the security app as Sarah entered with a man in a navy suit and Tommy Davidson. The equity release should be straightforward, the stranger said, pulling documents from a briefcase. Market appraisal gives us roughly 180 in available funds. The transfer documents are pre-signed, Sarah said, spreading papers across my coffee table. He won't contest anything. He's too proud. Tommy fidgeted. What if he lawyers up? He won't, Sarah said. He's starting over at 45 with nothing. I started recording. The attorney outlined a sale to a shell company for 60% of market value. Tommy discussed his uncle's timeline. Sarah provided details about my bank accounts and psychology. 8 years of marriage turned into criminal intelligence. At 4:17 p.m., I forwarded the live feed to Detective Patricia Reyes. At 4:22 p.m., copies went to Jake Martinez with a note. Audio is crystal clear. At 4:31 p.m., sirens announced themselves. By 4:45 p.m., I was watching 3 people in handcuffs being loaded into separate police cars while my neighbors gathered on their porches, wondering why their quiet Tuesday had turned into white-collar crime drama. I drove home to find crime scene tape across my front door and a detective's business card. Call when you get this. You'll want to hear what they said in the car. Some meetings wrote their own minutes in booking reports. The federal building on Stout Street had fluorescent lighting that made everyone look guilty. I sat across from Davidson's attorney, a man who charged $400 an hour to explain why bank fraud was really just a misunderstanding. Mr. Harrison, he began, isn't it true that you've been vindictive toward my client since your employment was terminated? I opened the blue notebook to page 12. Your client terminated my employment on March 15th at 3:47 p.m. The bank fraud occurred on March 12th at 11:23 a.m. Unless I've developed time travel capabilities, the timeline doesn't support vindictiveness as motivation. But you've actively solicited clients from your former employer. I've provided consulting services to companies that specifically requested my expertise. I flipped to page 27. Would you like me to read Janet Morrison's email? Quote, we specifically need someone who understands our technical infrastructure, not marketing presentations. Davidson shifted in his chair. Sarah's attorney was younger, hungrier, and clearly unprepared for 12 hours of high-definition video evidence. Mrs. Harrison was simply exploring financial options during a difficult time. I handed the court reporter Exhibit 17, the forged refinance application with signature analysis. Exploring financial options typically doesn't require falsifying someone else's signature on federal banking documents. The deposition lasted 4 hours. When Davidson's attorney suggested I was obsessed with documentation, I listed dates, amounts, and case numbers until the room itself seemed to take my side. The silence that followed lasted 43 seconds. Any further questions? Jake asked. None that anyone wanted answered. Revenge felt like paperwork stamped with official seals and case numbers that would follow people longer than memory. The Pinnacle Solutions conference room had views of the mountains and whiteboards that held my handwriting instead of someone else's promises. 6 weeks after the depositions, I signed documents that made my consulting arrangement permanent. Senior Technical Director, Equity Participation, and a non-compete clause that specifically excluded my former employer as irrelevant to my future. Marcus Webb slid the final contract across the glass table. The Meridian project exceeded every specification. They're requesting you personally for the Phase 2 expansion. 18-month timeline, 7-figure budget. I initialed the last page and thought about Davidson's nephew trying to explain technical architecture to clients who'd worked with actual experts. The market had rendered its verdict faster than any court. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Martinez, my old analyst, not my ex-wife, who was currently serving 18 months in federal prison for bank fraud. 3 more clients called asking if you're available for consulting. Word travels fast in this industry. It traveled faster than I'd expected. Janet Morrison from Meridian had mentioned my work to her board. Her board had mentioned it to colleagues. Those colleagues had called competitors who were tired of paying premium rates for substandard results. Technical competence was apparently a scarce commodity in a field full of people who could present but couldn't deliver. "Any word from your old firm?" Marcus asked. I checked LinkedIn on my phone. Davidson and Associates had posted another strategic restructuring announcement, their 3rd this quarter. Tommy Davidson was no longer listed as director. His profile now showed seeking new opportunities and a headshot that looked increasingly desperate. "They're recruiting," I said. "Posted 6 technical positions last week. Market rate plus 20%. Finding anyone?" Hard to replace institutional memory when you fire the institution. The irony was elegant. They'd calculated that my expertise could be extracted, documented, and transferred to cheaper labor. But expertise wasn't software you could copy. It was accumulated judgment, pattern recognition, and the kind of problem-solving that came from solving actual problems rather than studying them. My calendar showed 3 client meetings this week, all with companies that had specifically requested me by name. Not Pinnacle Solutions, not technical consulting services, but me, the person who'd handled their crises, understood their infrastructure, and delivered results when results mattered. The gravity had shifted. Companies orbited around competence, not corporate charts. At 5 p.m., I packed the blue notebook, now joined by 2 more, equally detailed, and drove home to a house that was legally mine again, thanks to restitution orders and asset recovery judgments. The security cameras still recorded everything, but now they were just watching a quiet neighborhood where people came home to families who didn't forge their signatures. Trust lived where respect lived. Work lived where competence lived. I brought nothing proprietary from my old life, only my name, my methods, and the relationships I'd earned one solved crisis at a time. Some things couldn't be stolen because they'd never belonged to anyone else. The final court order arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 months after I'd learned what public humiliation felt like. The envelope was thin, just 3 pages of legal text that closed chapters I'd never planned to open. Restitution paid in full. Property lines terminated. Consent decree filed with the corporate compliance office that would follow Davidson and Associates until they either reformed or dissolved. I filed the papers in a folder labeled Proof Kept and went back to reviewing technical specifications for a project that would keep me busy through the following spring. The house felt different now. Not because of new furniture or security updates, but because silence meant peace instead of surveillance. The cameras still recorded, but they watched a neighborhood where people came home to families who signed their own names on their own documents. Emma called during lunch. "Dad, I saw the news about your old company. Something about federal compliance violations?" "Ancient history," I said. "How's the new semester?" She was studying engineering at CSU, paying for it with her own scholarships and a part-time job that taught her the value of work done honestly. She didn't need to know the details of adult betrayals or how justice sometimes moved slower than injury, but more thoroughly than revenge. At 5:30, I took Murphy for his evening walk. The golden retriever had weathered the chaos better than anyone, maintaining his faith in routine walks and regular meals while his humans figured out complicated questions about trust and consequences. We passed the Henderson house, where lights glowed warm in kitchen windows and children's laughter carried across well-maintained lawns. Normal families living normal lives, unaware that their quiet neighbor had spent 6 months learning how institutional betrayal worked and how institutional accountability responded. A text from Marcus Webb. Meridian Phase 3 approved. Board voted unanimously to extend your contract through 2027. They specifically requested you remain as lead technical architect. I forwarded the message to Jake Martinez with a note. Market verdict, competence wins. His reply came immediately. Court verdict, crime doesn't pay. Bank fraud conviction upheld on appeal. Your ex-wife's parole hearing denied. I deleted both messages and continued walking. Justice felt like paperwork filed correctly and accounts balanced according to law. Not satisfaction. That was too personal, too small. Resolution. The kind that let you sleep without wondering what tomorrow's crisis would reveal about yesterday's lies. At the corner of Maple and 15th, Murphy stopped to investigate something fascinating in the grass. I checked my phone. No urgent emails, no crisis calls, no meetings that couldn't wait until morning. The absence of emergency had become a luxury I'd forgotten to notice. We walked home as streetlights flickered on, past windows where people clapped for each other without calculation, past lives where loyalty meant what it promised and work meant what it paid. I didn't look back. There was nothing behind me worth the view. Inside, I opened the blue notebook to a fresh page and wrote tomorrow's agenda. Client meeting at 9, technical review at 11, lunch with colleagues who called me by name instead of title. The future looked remarkably like work done honestly for people who paid fairly. Some accounts balance themselves once you stop donating to the wrong ledgers.